and they waited to see which monkeys became the dominant monkeys and which monkeys became the subordinate monkeys. And they scanned their brains before and after. And the monkeys that became dominant, when they scanned their brains lit up with all kinds of happy chemicals, so they're sort of glowing and sparking on the neural scans. And the subordinate monkeys, their brains weren't buzzing alight with happy chemicals. And then they taught the monkeys to take cocaine, and they taught them to administer cocaine to themselves, and the monkeys could choose to take as much cocaine as they wanted. The dominant monkeys didn't bother, because their brains were already alight with happy things, but the subordinate monkeys took a lot of cocaine. And I think if you think about what status was doing to monkey brain hormones and what that meant for their sort of self-medication, you can start to perhaps understand what's going on underneath this picture. Here's infant mortality in relation to income inequality. And I just want to point out, up here we've got the US, spends about $6,000 per person per year on healthcare. And down here we've got Greece, spends half as much. But you're 40% more likely to have an infant die in the USA than you are in Greece. And you will actually live a year and 2 months less on average as well in the US. Here's obesity, a problem that has been growing, pardon the pun, over the past few years. So clearly something is happening, something is changing in our societies, and more people are becoming obese. A strong relationship with inequality. It's stronger for women than for men, but up here we've got about 30% of the population obese, and down here less than 3%. So really large differences between countries, and again, strongly related to inequality. This is dropping out of high school in US states. We could have showed you performance on educational test scores internationally and in different US states, but this is a sort of similar finding. And again, enormous differences. Down here at the bottom, about 10% of kids dropping out of high school, but in some states, over a quarter. More than 1 in 4 children not finishing with what we would call a sort of standard educational qualification. And here's the teenage birth rate, going from a high of about 50 per 1,000 down to a low of less than 5 in Japan. But again, a close relationship here. And in fact, this is quite a simple picture, but it hides even greater differences between countries than you can see here. In Japan, it's got a low rate of teenage births, but 86% of those teen mothers are married. So they're probably not mothers that we would actually be worrying about socially. And up here in the USA with the highest rate, only about a quarter of those young women are married. Here's homicide, so the murder rate for US states, which are round dots, and Canadian provinces, which you probably can't see very well, but they're the triangles. The Canadian provinces are all down here, and the US states are all up here. But they all sort of fit along the same line. The more inequality you've got, the higher the homicide rate. The differences are quite staggering. We're going from less than about 10, 15 per million up to over 150. So sort of a 15-fold, 10 to 15-fold difference. And the same sort of scale of differences for imprisonment. And this is imprisonment in different countries. I just want to point out this one's on a log scale, okay, unlike all of the others. Because if we didn't put it on a log scale, we wouldn't be able to get the USA on. It would be up there somewhere, and we wouldn't be able to fit it on the graph. Now, imprisonment rates aren't just driven by crime rates. They're partly driven by crime rates, but they're also driven by the rate at which convicted criminals get sent to prison, rather than given a fine or some community service, and the length of those sentences. And here's imprisonment for US states, and US researchers have calculated that the rise in imprisonment over time in the US, only 12% of it is attributed to changes in the crime rate. The rest of it is attributed to changes in incarceration rates and the length of prison sentences. And when we were doing research for our book, I think we came across some quite shocking statistics related to imprisonment. In the state of California, there are 260 people who are in prison for life for shoplifting because of their 3 strikes and you're outlaw. And in the same state, since 1984, California has built 1 new college, 21 new prisons. So we're seeing a shift in sort of the harshness of society, the way in which people who have criminal convictions are viewed, the way we decide to treat people has changed over time. And this sort of harshness, this difference in how we treat criminals is strongly related to how hierarchical a society is. I'm afraid there are actually 40 people sent to prison in the UK every day for shoplifting as well, but they don't usually go for life. We've divided the states into 2 groups and we've coloured them differently. So the states that are coloured in blue are those that have abolished the death penalty, and the states that are coloured in red are those that have chosen to retain the death penalty. And you can see there's a tendency for those that have abolished it to be the more equal of the states, and those that have retained it are more likely to be among the less equal of the states.
I want to start off from this slide, which is one of the early ones that Kate showed. It's the combined index of health and social problems, in which all these health and social problems are weighted equally. I want to come back to it really for 2 reasons. One is really to ask, are there other ways of explaining this lineup, that these countries have more social problems and these say less? Is there any explanation apart from saying that the ones that do worse are more unequal? People used sometimes to say it's the English-speaking countries that do worse, and you know, you've got New Zealand, UK, USA, but actually on some of the variables that we've looked at, some of the social problems, you can actually explain why one of the English-speaking countries does worse than another in terms of the amount of inequality. I think that's true on, for instance, mental illness. But the other thing is, it's not always English-speaking countries doing badly. There's Portugal, very different kind of society from the USA. And when we have data for Singapore, it's usually up here too. And actually, it's hard to think of societies more different from each other than USA, UK, Portugal, Singapore. It's not just a cultural similarity up there, explaining why those do badly. If you look at the countries that do well, again, you might say that there's not this cultural similarity between the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands. They all do pretty well. But Japan is down there too. And actually, it's hard to think of societies more different from each other in the developed world than Sweden and Japan. And think of the position of women, or how closely they keep to the traditional nuclear family structure. Think even of the way they get their greater equality. The Japanese, well, the Swedes do it largely through taxes and benefits redistribution, a large welfare state. The Japanese, on the other hand, spend less, the public social expenditure is a smaller part of their GNP per capita than in any of the other, I think almost any of the other OECD countries. So Japan and Sweden are at opposite ends of the pole from that point of view. But Japan manages to be equal because its incomes before taxation, differences in earnings are smaller. So, you know, Sweden is the big state model and Japan has a small state. So not only differences in position of women, in family structure, but also in the role of the state. And yet they're both fairly equal, and so they both do well. So I don't think one can say that these countries are down here simply because of something about the Nordic countries.